like Belknap, and of course here, like President Trump. And just so we're clear, in full disclosure, this is another argument that was not addressed by President Trump in his rebuttal. And we know why they didn't. Because their argument doesn't square with the plain text of the Constitution. There is one provision that President Trump relies on almost exclusively. Article 2, Section 4. I'm sure you'll see it when they present their arguments. Their argument is that the language you'll see on the screen somehow prevents you from holding this trial by making removal from office an absolute requirement. But again, where does the language say that? Where does it say anything in that provision about your jurisdiction? In fact, this provision isn't even in the part of the Constitution that addresses your authority. It's in Article 2, not Article 1. And it certainly says nothing about former officials. President Trump's interpretation doesn't square with history, originalism, textualism. In fact, even Chuck Cooper, the famous conservative lawyer I mentioned earlier, with clients like the House Minority Leader, he has concluded that this provision of the Constitution that President Trump relies on cuts against his position, his words. And that's because, as Cooper says, Article 2, Section 4 means just what it says. In the first half, describes what an official must do to be impeached, namely commit high crimes and misdemeanors. And the second half describes what happens when civil officers of the United States, including the sitting president, are convicted. Removal from office. That's it. In Cooper's words, it simply establishes what is known in criminal law as a mandatory minimum punishment. It says nothing about former officials. Nothing at all. Given all of that, it is not surprising that in President Trump's legal trial brief, 75-page brief, they struggled to find any professors to support their position. They did cite one professor, though. Professor Kalt is an expert in this field, who they claimed agreed with them that the only purpose of impeachment is removal. Professor Kalt's position, which they had to have known because it's in the article that they cite in the brief, is that removal is, quote, not the sole end of impeachment. Actually, in that same article, he describes the view advocated by President Trump's lawyers as having deep flaws. And again, you do not have to take my word for it. You can take Professor Kalt's word for it, the professor they cited in their brief filed yesterday, because he tweeted about it. On the screen here, this is what he had to say. I'm not going to read through it in great detail. I'll just simply give you the highlights. President Trump's brief cites my 2001 article on late impeachment a lot, but in several places, they misrepresent what I wrote quite badly. There are multiple examples of such flat-out misrepresentations. They didn't have to be disingenuous and misleading like this. This key constitutional scholar, relied on by President Trump, said it just right. I have explained in great detail the many reasons why the argument that President Trump advocates for here today is wrong. I just want to close with a note about why it's dangerous. Lead manager Raskin explained that impeachment exists to protect the American people from officials who abuse their power, who betray them. It exists for a case just like this one. Honestly, it is hard to imagine a clearer example of how a president could abuse his office, inciting violence against a co-equal branch of government while seeking to remain in power after losing an election. Sitting back and watching it unfold. We all know the consequences. Like every one of you, I was in the Capitol on January 6th. I was on the floor with lead manager Raskin. Like every one of you, I was evacuated as this violent mob stormed the Capitol's gates. What you experienced that day, what we experienced that day, what our country experienced that day, is the framers' worst nightmare come to life. Presidents can't inflame insurrection in their final weeks and then walk away like nothing happened. And yet that is the rule that President Trump asks you to adopt. I urge you, we urge you, to decline his request, to vindicate the Constitution, to let us try this case.
President, distinguished senators, my name is David Cicilline. I have the honor of representing the 1st Congressional District of Rhode Island. As I hope is now clear from the arguments of Mr. Raskin and Mr. Neguse, impeachment is not merely about removing someone from office. Fundamentally, impeachment exists to protect our constitutional system, to keep each of us safe, to uphold our freedom, to safeguard our democracy. It achieves that by deterring abuse of the extraordinary power that we entrust to our presidents, from the very first day in office to the very last day. It also ensures accountability for presidents who harm us or our government. In the aftermath of a tragedy, it allows us an opportunity to come together and to heal by working through what happened and reaffirming our constitutional principles. And it authorizes this body, and this body alone, to disqualify from our political system anybody whose conduct in office proves that they present a danger to the republic. But impeachment would fail to achieve these purposes if you created, for the first time ever, despite the words of the framers and the Constitution, a January exception, as Mr. Raskin explained. Now, I was a former defense lawyer for many years, and I can understand why President Trump and his lawyers don't want you to hear this case, why they don't want you to see the evidence. The argument that you lack jurisdiction rests on a purely fictional loophole. Purely fictional. Designed to allow the former president to escape all accountability for conduct that is truly indefensible under our Constitution. You saw the consequences of his actions on the video that we played earlier. I'd like to emphasize in still greater detail the extraordinary constitutional offense that the former president thinks you have no power whatsoever to adjudicate. While spreading lies about the election outcome in a brazen attempt to retain power against the will of the American people, he incited an armed, angry mob to riot. And not just anywhere, but here, in the seat of our government, in the Capitol, during a joint session of Congress, when the Vice President presided while we carried out the peaceful transfer of power, which was interrupted for the first time in our history. This was a disaster of historic proportion. was also an unforgivable betrayal of the oath of office of President Trump, the oath he swore, an oath that he sullied and dishonored to advance his own personal interests. And make no mistake about it, as you think about that day, things could have been much worse. As one senator said, they could have killed all of us. It was only the bravery and sacrifice of the police who suffered deaths and injuries as a result of President Trump's actions that prevented greater tragedy. At trial, we will prove with overwhelming evidence that President Trump is singularly and directly responsible for inciting the assault on the Capitol. We will also prove that his dereliction of duty, his desire to seek personal advantage from the mayhem, and his decision to issue tweets further inciting the mob, attacking the vice president, all compounded the already enormous damage. Now, virtually every American who saw those events unfold on television was absolutely horrified by the events of January 6th. But we also know how President Trump himself felt about the attack. He told us. Here's what he tweeted at 6:01 as the Capitol was in shambles and as dozens of police officers and other law enforcement officers lay battered and bruised and bloodied. Here's what he said: "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously